Well, Dr. Randy Woodley, thank you for joining us on A Pastor and a Philosopher Walk Into a Bar.
Yeah, I have a question about that.
All right, fire away.
What do they say when they go in the bar?
We should come up with a good answer to that.
We should.
We need a punchline.
No good answer, Dr. Woodley.
We don't
I'm sorry.
have one.
Yeah, it's like usually it's like, and the pastor said yada yada, and the philosopher said yada yada.
You have to tune in to find out the punchline, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay.
We just like to drink, man. I don't know.
We
Well,
do.
you heard the one about the man, the dog that walked in the bar, right?
Nope.
Why the long face? Oh, was that the horse? That was the
No, that was the horse had the long face. So the guy walks in, and he's got a dog with him. Bar owner says, "You can't bring a dog in here." He goes, "No, this is a talking dog." He's like, "Right." He goes, "No, he is. If I can get him to talk, can you front me a drink?" He's like, "Oh yeah, go ahead." So he asked him. He says to the dog, "What's on top of the house?" He says, "Roof, roof." And then he says, "Who's the greatest baseball player of all time?" "Ruth, Ruth." And the bartender says, "I'm not giving you a drink for that. Get out of here." He throws him out, and they're walking down the street. The dog turns to him and says, "Was it Ty Cobb?"
That's good. That's good.
Nice.
There we go. Good start to the interview. So, Randy, this is where we normally ask our guests to tell us about themselves, but you opened up your book saying that and I'm going to not get this pronunciation right, but in your Kituwa tradition, you're not supposed to talk about yourself. Can you just tell us about that?
Well, it's sort of like that verse in scripture that says, like, give honor to who honor is due, and let other people sing your praise. So the idea is, if you're going to talk about yourself, you're probably not very humble.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So do you want to talk about yourself, or should we do that in the beginning?
Well, yeah, I'm not very humble, so that,
works out.
All right. So tell our listeners about yourself a little bit, Randy.
So they can find out more at eloheh.org, eloheh.org. And so my wife and I have a place called Eloheh Indigenous Center for Earth Justice and Eloheh Farm and Seeds. So we're farmers and we're teachers, and we have a community, and we have our cultural ceremonies and things here. And yeah, it just becomes a sort of a all around center for gathering and, people learning stuff. So, yeah, and we've been doing that on and off for, let's see, since about 2004.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So the book is Indigenous Theology in the Western Worldview, a decolonized approach to Christian doctrine. I absolutely loved this book. And you've written many other books, correct? Or a number of
Yeah, I published 3 this year.
Yeah, we got a mailer from the publisher, and there was a list of your books on it, and I looked at the dates, and they were all 2022, and I was like, "What the heck?"
Yeah, we call that a monster of a
What's this
writer.
guy
Yeah.
doing?
Last year was a good year for writing.
Good. Well, so right in the beginning of your book, you say that you and your wife's work with your seed company, preserving open pollinated, organic, native heirloom seeds, is every bit as important to you as your theological work, and that you don't see a difference between them. Can you explain that to us a little bit?
If I don't see a difference, I don't know how I'm going to explain it.
What would you say to someone who sees a big difference?
Yes.
I would ask them how. I think that form of what I would call superficial categorization is kind of endemic to the Western worldview, right? And so everything is categorized separately. But in my worldview, like these seeds have everything to do with everything. Without seeds, we don't eat. Why farm if we're not going to eat? You have to understand the land. You have to understand the gift it is from Creator. It's all interrelated. So, it's like there's a way that you look at life, and you just say, like, everything's one thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you don't have, you talk a lot about dualism, binaries in your book. And seems like in the indigenous worldview, it's less categorical and less broken apart, less kind of decentered and more just kind of like you just said, this is all one life that we're living and everything relates to one another. Is that right?
Yeah. So this extrinsic categorization that occurs in the West, there's really nothing wrong with that. I think it actually is a gift. So, I'm really glad that I have not just a general practitioner, but I also have a cardiologist, and I also have a podiatrist, and I also have a neurologist, and they all specialize in their certain areas. But like if one treats me out of just their concern for my body and doesn't take consideration of my whole body and what's going on with everything else, then I might end up dead. Mm-hmm. So the point being is that when we categorize in these, I can just call them superficial categories, these extrinsic categories, it's okay. It's okay to study deeply in certain areas, but the problem with the West is it begins to act as if that category is all of reality. Yeah. And so then that becomes a false reality. So I call it putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. The West has to begin to understand that it's just like all the work that's been done on the last 60 years on psychosomatic illness, right? So at first people were probably going, there's nothing to that. In fact, I remember when they were saying there's nothing to that. But to understand that our bodies and our minds, and then I would add our spirit, although I don't believe in a tripartite person, I think we're all one whole thing, but it's helpful sometimes to talk about them in this way. All right. But let's remember that we are all of those things. We're not just one of those things. And that's exactly the definition of dualism, is to say the Platonic dualism is to prioritize the ethereal or the abstract or the mind or whatever over the material world, over the body, over the earth, etc. And so we got to keep it together. I guess that's a good phrase we can use.
Yeah. Amen to that. So you talked about superficial categorization. I assume that implies that you think there are some categories that aren't superficial, that are worth preserving. So what's your method for distinguishing?
Well, basically their relationship. We have let's just talk about the animal kingdom, right? So somebody thought of, and I forget them all, but they are like, kingdom, phylum, species, yada, yada, yada. And but so in the native world, it's like the things that fly, the things that crawl, the two-legged things, the four-legged things, the things that swim, the things that have roots, the things that have wings. So those are categories that create everything that's related to that is that, all right? Mm-hmm. So they're more relational, I would say.
That's interesting. So I'm going to get you to define Western worldview in just a second, but I think this will play right into that, because what you just described is very consonant with Aristotle and carving nature at the joints, kind of goes back to his delineation of, he may have been the one that came up with that kingdom phyla thing. I'm not really sure. Don't quote me on that, but it goes back close to that far. And so he would be, if I had to pick the progenitor of the Western worldview, I don't think I'd do much better than to pick him. So I'm curious what similarities or major differences you see in what you just described as the indigenous worldview versus what you're calling Western.
Yeah, and this is great to have a philosopher to talk about these things with. So I go back to we really don't know what Socrates said, because everything is written by Plato, right? And other of his works were destroyed, so it's hard to know where Plato begins and Socrates ends. But I go back to Plato's, placing more privilege on the ethereal, the abstract, the Plato's cave kind of a thing. And then as his student, Aristotle, didn't buy into, as you probably well know, didn't buy completely into that. But with Plato's idea of different kinds of people and all of those kinds of things, and that the mind being central and everything else sort of being subsidiary. And then, as we get to people like Descartes, who said, I am a soul, but I have a body, Um, there's been this kind of like long thread of this dualistic thing. And so Aristotle, yes, categorization, that's one thing. And was it Aristotle or was it Plato who did the metals, people as metals?
Yeah, it's Plato.
Yeah. So, but Aristotle, as people have said, is perhaps the father of modern racism, because he said, well, some people were slaveable and others were meant to rule slaves, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, whoever makes those pronouncements generally sees themselves as the ones who are supposed to rule, right? Coincidentally. Um, so, um, so yeah, that is the beginning, as far as I can tell. I'm sure they got it from somebody else, but that's the beginning, as far as I can tell, of this idea that we are separate from our minds, or that at least that part of us is privileged, as opposed to what I would call a holistic reality.
Mm-hmm.
And so, from an indigenous worldview, we would say we are all of that. So, for example, an indigenous doctor, in the old days, there's a few that still do this, but mostly in the old days, would go and ask you when something was wrong, like, what have you been eating? What are your relationships like? What have you been dreaming about? Have you gone somewhere you weren't supposed to go? Just sort of like all these things that would seem somewhat random to perhaps a medical doctor now, but they would understand them as all being related somehow, because they're part of a bigger worldview, more holistic kind of a worldview.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's fascinating. Fun. Yeah. I'm going to switch gears entirely here and ask you to tell a story that you tell in the first chapter of your book, because it's set in Wisconsin, and we're in Wisconsin. So you talk about only speaking in places where you've been invited, and a story that you tell about a particular speaking occasion you had in Wisconsin where you realized you hadn't been invited by the relevant party, and so you set out in search of this person and came across a boy who had a LSD trip. It was just this whole involved really interesting story, and I wonder if you could tell maybe an abbreviated version of that for our listeners.
Yeah. So, this is up on the Lakudere Reservation, up in around Hayward, and so just before I had arrived at this place this YWAM base where we were supposed to do some teaching for the week, training Native leaders. And there was a young man there who they had just picked up, and his story was like he and his brother had an acid trip in Seattle. I think they were in Seattle, and they were adopted out from that Lakudere Reservation. And he saw Jesus there in his trip, and he told him to go back to his reservation. Well, so he got picked up, I think the night before, or maybe even hours before we got there. And so my first question to the proprietor was like, who invited you guys here? And he said, well, it was the pastor of the church next door, and they gave us the land. And I'm like, well, what tribe is he? And well, he's Mohawk. He's not, so who gave you permission from the people here? Nobody. So before, now if you'd have said, yeah, we were welcomed by the Lakudere people, and that would have been fine, but they weren't. And so I needed to figure out who it was. And so I took this young man with me, because he obviously had been raised without his culture, and I wanted him to see, like, this is how you do things, right? So I'll shorten this up. We go into the store, and I buy this big basket and fill it with all kinds of stuff that you would give elders as a gift basket. We found out where he lives. He was the advisor to the tribe from the elder group, and also one of the leaders of their particular religion there, the traditional religion. So I thought we were about the right person. And so we went, big snowy day. The guy started talking to us, asked what we wanted. I explained, why we were there. And then he started telling us stories, right? And, but every so often he would say, my uncle, who trained most of the medicine men around these parts and in parts of Canada and Minnesota and other places, he lived to be 107 years old. He trained most of the medicine people around. And he always told me, he said, don't disrespect Jesus because he's a great spirit. And so I was like, oh, that's interesting. So he would go on and he'd tell another story. And he had a lot of stories within the story. We were there for quite a while. Mm-hmm. But every so often he would break in and say that same thing. My uncle would say, to me, don't disrespect Jesus. He's a great spirit. And so he finally got toward the end, I think, of his talk with us. And he said, so I asked my uncle one time, Uncle, how do you know all this stuff about Jesus? And he said, well, I told you, I talked to him. And he said, yeah, but you know all these stories, though. Did you go to boarding school? No. Did the priest come and talk to you? No. Did you go to church? No. Do you have a Bible? No. He said, I told you, I talked to him. And then this elder says to us, and so I asked my uncle again, yeah, but how do you know all this stuff about Jesus? And my uncle, he says, looked at me like I was a child and said, well, of course he talks back. And then he said, now I'm going to pray for you and ask for a blessing, and you're welcome to stay here and speak. So that was the story, right?
Yeah.
And I told that deliberately to that group because it's a bit of a hoity-toity, the Hayward lectures. And I wanted to create some disequilibrium, right? Because I knew that that in that particular crowd and genre, that they would be extremely critical. So I thought I'm gonna create disequilibrium and I did that particularly because in that liminal space is where you actually start to listen to people, right? And listen to other things that you don't normally hear. So I want them to know you're going to hear stuff that you don't normally hear.
Yeah. While we're talking about Jesus, let me ask you about a thing you say in the book at one point. You say, you can be a Christian and follow Jesus, but it's very difficult.
Yeah. And so I always tell people I'm not a Christian. We practice our native traditions, but we follow Jesus. And but I like to add the caveat, you can be a Christian and follow Jesus, but it's really, really hard. It's hard to do.
What makes it hard?
And that's mostly because, Western Christianity is basically the tool of empire. I mean, it's there's like all you have to do is know history, right? And we can say as much as we want, yeah, but those weren't real Christians, or that, but the bottom line is what has represented Christianity to the world in the West, particularly the Native Americans, but other folks too, has been an oppressive regime of empire. And so Jesus is antithetical to that sort of Christianity. Jesus is actually the decolonized mind, the one who comes against empire and illegitimate powers, the one who resists in so many ways, like Walter Wink would say, Jesus' third way, right? Mm-hmm. So how can you follow Jesus in the midst of an oppressive regime? Well, it is possible, but it's difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is it okay if we camp out on this topic for just a minute before?
Yeah. Let me just ask, do you think that word Christian or Christianity is important at all?
To who?
To, like, if I identify as a Jesus follower, is that word Christian, do you think it's too loaded in the American context to even be valid or worth hanging on to?
Well, I think so. I think first of all, we have to realize that Jesus never became a Christian, and I think he came to start a movement for anybody, not for a particular religion. And but I'm sure, absolutely certain, that if he came to start a religion, it would look nothing like Western Christianity. So I'm pretty sure we're on safe ground. And then if you want to be biblical, you can find out that no one in Scripture ever called themselves a Christian. And there's actually, a few books out now who talk about it wasn't until the 3rd century that anybody ever did.
Yeah. So, how do you understand Jesus's relationship to American indigenous religious traditions?
Yeah, so all the people, so I pastored a native church for 7 years, and I've been in and out of the native community for all these years, and I've found very few people who have a hard time with Jesus. They like him. They think that he's great. They think he's like our medicine man, that he's a prophet, that he's, and so there's a pretty high regard, but not the Jesus brought by the colonizer
Mm-hmm.
or the missionizer. That Jesus has just come to take things away. And like for Native America, I've my good friend Richard Twiss, who's passed on, used to say it this way: the missionary said to our Native people, Jesus loves you, but he doesn't really like you. He doesn't like your language. You have to get rid of that. He doesn't like your long hair. He doesn't like these dream catchers. He doesn't like whatever else that's native. He doesn't like that. So basically, Jesus doesn't like you, but he loves you.
Yeah.
And that's a very weird kind of a message, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so speaking of mission and missiology and indigenous cultures and Jesus and Christianity, you tell a story in the end of the book about a person who basically evangelized. I hate that word, but I'll just use it. Evangelized this indigenous people group, and he said, "I just told the story." He said something similar to this. You'll know better than me. I just told the story, and I let them theologize it. Explain
Exactly.
that.
Yeah, that was a wonderful time. I had lunch with one of my good friends, one of my students, and became a friend. Her grandfather, who was a missionary to the Calahan in the Philippines, and they all became followers of Jesus. And I asked him, I said, how did this happen? And he said it was pretty easy, really. He said, I just told the stories, and they did the theologizing. And I think that was actually how the scriptures began.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, most of everything we have there was actually oral at one time, except for Paul's letter writing campaigns,
Mm-hmm.
which were all addressing some kind of occasional, problem in the church. But so yeah, it's like orality is what's most natural to tell the story. But then and this is part again of the extrinsic categorization. We want to chop them up into, chapters and verses, and then we have rules about how our hermeneutical rules about how to interpret that and the verses around it. And instead of just going, hey, it's a story, let's hear the story, and then let's take it from there. And how we understand story, of course, is very different too between the West and indigenous peoples around the world. The Bible being mostly story, about 90% story. And in the West, it's sort of like the first reaction is it fact? Did it happen?
Mm-hmm.
And that's truth to the West. Whereas other peoples around the world and indigenous peoples in this continent, the first thing is like, what's the truth in the story? That's what matters.
Yes.
Not did it happen,
Mm-hmm.
but what's true about it? What do I need to learn from it? So I think the whole thing is kind of the West has created the Bible as the fourth person of the Trinity. We call it biblicism, but we've got to stop that. That's ridiculous.
Yeah. So one last one before you take back over, Kyle. For those of us listening or hosting who don't have a PhD, can you tell us what you think he meant by "I told them the stories and I let them do the theologizing"? What does that mean?
Yeah, so I think, and I have friends who disagree with me, native scholar friends, and who would say, I'm glad the scriptures are translated in our languages, etc. And I'm not one of those. I don't. I think we had our own ways of remembering and learning story and listening to story, and they should have just been given orally like they were meant to be. Hearing something that's different than reading it. Hearing a story. And in fact, I during my work on my PhD, which was like 3 years there, I didn't read the Bible once. I only listened to it. If I had something I needed to reference, I would ask my wife, "Can you read this to me?"
Wow.
I wanted to experience it in a more indigenous way than that, going to and reading and finding the verse and chapter. And so it made all the difference in the world of how I began to hear things.
Mhm.
These are stories, and it's really important to listen to the stories. And then each person, culture, group, whatever, then needs to figure out, like, well, what does that mean based on my worldview?
Mhm.
And of course, then I'm 100% behind all the studying, letter writing, and antiquities, and the original languages and everything else, because they help us understand the social background of what's going on. That's all important stuff. We can't, if we need to apply it to us, we can't apply it to us unless we understand first what it meant to them, right? So, but then those stories also are given to us in our cultures, and we begin to theologize on them and say, like, well, in my culture, that might not mean the same thing as it does in their culture. And so I have to figure out what that means. But if I have someone else telling me what they think it should mean,
Mhm.
then it's no longer my story.
Mhm.
It's their story.
Yep.
Yeah.
Great.
Let me ask you just a couple more questions about Jesus, and then we can move on to something else. Although, let's be honest, it's all about Jesus in some way. You say at one point Jesus was an indigenous man. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, he was like a, brown skinned uh, dude from a village and a tribe. And he certainly relates, I think, much closer to what we would consider indigenous people now than post Enlightenment Western people.
Mm-hmm.
And he understood story, I think, in the way that more indigenous people do. Um, he had the opportunity to talk about all kinds of things, inventions and modern stuff that the Romans had invented. And yeah, but he ends up speaking almost exclusively, not about those things, but about the things in nature,
Seeds and
seeds
dirt.
and fields and dirt and, trees and birds and, plants and, and so, yeah, he just seems very much like an indigenous person to me.
Yeah. So then, how do you understand? Because he's also Jewish, right? So how do you
Mhm.
understand the relationship between a Native American Jesus follower and, or I don't know what you'd call that, Native American Christianity, for lack of a better term, and Judaism, right? Because colonial Christianity has had difficult histories with both. Mainstream Christian theology has been both anti-native and anti-Semitic.
Mhm.
So you're an indigenous theologian who follows a first century Jewish man. Is that a complicated
Not
integration
at
for
all. I
you?
think it's very helpful to, to sit with my Jewish brothers and sisters and hear what they had to say. In fact, last Friday night at Shabbat, my wife and I spoke at the largest synagogue here in Portland,
Hmm.
Hmm.
and we talked. They asked us to talk about what it means to be indigenous and what Jews might learn about their own indigeneity.
Oh, that's good.
And I think there's so much there in common that yeah, there's a whole field of openness and response that could take place. It's
Yeah.
um, so it's, I think we inform each other. Yeah.
Hmm.
Awesome.
Yeah. You say in the book that your theology starts with the land, or it starts with the earth. White American Christians can be listening right now and get a little bit freaked out about that and think that that might be a little bit heretical. What do you mean when you say your theology begins with the land and the earth?
Well, what do you mean by saying it doesn't? Because I mean, that's abstract, right?
Okay.
So it's got to begin somewhere, and it's got to begin physically. Everything rests upon the earth. I stand upon the earth. God puts us on the earth. Where else could it begin? I mean, this is like the first teacher and the first home, and
Mhm.
everything about it is a gift. So how could it not begin on the earth? I don't understand how you would start somewhere else.
So if someone would say, my theology begins with Jesus or my theology begins with God himself, do you think
Well,
that's silliness?
yeah, well, I would say, well, that's very abstract because God gave us manifest, Jesus on earth and gave us everything that we have on earth. So if you say I begin with God, then you're beginning with some abstract idea.
Mhm.
So yeah, I mean, think about it. Like, how else do you actually begin a theology? This is the earth was here long before there was a Bible.
Mhm.
You know, it's been teaching us, creation has been teaching us ever since human beings are walking the earth, and learning from the rest of the community of creation and everything else, because that's the way creator intended it to be. And even in the first chapters of Genesis, you know, you have this great, you know, earth and everything else is tov meod, right? It's very, very good. And then in Genesis 2:15, you have the story of like, what are human beings being created for? To care for the earth, to co-sustain, not to rule and dominate. That's a misunderstanding of the whole context, but to tend the garden, to be what I call co-sustainers. And so our very purpose as people is to care for the whole community of creation, or the earth.
Yeah. Yeah, it's our first task. It's beautiful. You've mentioned creator a few times, and I love that. Yeah, I love it. You also mentioned in the book, you mentioned creator and great mystery. Can you just define those terms for our listeners?
So I mean, we have to turn to Kyle here, and like, if something's a mystery, how do you explain it, right?
Yeah, we've talked about that before.
He's uncomfortable with mystery.
I am. I'm very uncomfortable. Yeah. I'm uncomfortable with mystery as a terminus to a dialectic, but I don't think that's how you're using it.
Yeah, I'm saying Great Spirit is probably the most theologically accurate name for God that we have.
Great Spirit. Okay.
It means that this is the greatest mystery there is, right? And the wonderful thing about diversity and different people's understanding, their understandings of who God is that we all come together, and there's this big picture, right? But but still, even with everybody, it's still like, this is beyond our comprehension. It's a great mystery. So we say creator, like where everything comes from, right? And we say one of the words that we have in my tribe is Unetlanahi, which is like the one who's behind everything, right? And the sun's the most visible, symbol of that, if you will. And so they used to call us sun worshipers, because we would, like, put our hands up and pray to the sun, and there's a whole thing about Southeastern sun cult and all that kind of stuff. But no, it was the one who was behind the sun. And it was just the physical manifestation of that one that seemed like the greatest representation. So yeah, so I think those words are as good as any.
Yeah.
Be better than some.
Is creator gendered in Indigenous
No.
religion?
No.
Okay.
There's so many things I want to ask you.
I know.
We don't have time.
We were just laughing that this is our most unscripted interview we've done maybe ever.
Like, I didn't put anything about gender on the outline, and now I want to talk about it.
I know. Yeah.
Well, good, because I'd rather do an impromptu thing, where we actually deal with what our real questions are. So, and those change, right? Process is the most important thing to me, because it's the process that creates that sacred moment that can never be repeated again, right?
Yep. So you mentioned going to the elder in northern Wisconsin, to the elder of the tribe, and getting his permission to be there and to be on the land. And in the book, you speak of elders as well in your culture, and you make a reference to say, I don't think of myself as an elder or a future elder. But I'm wondering, what do you think is the future of Native American culture as this generation of elders passes away? Yeah.
Well, my generation of elders have all gone except for one that I recall. So that's a really sad thing, and it does mean something very different for us. I just read, there's a lot of controversy with Native people around Thanksgiving, right? Because it becomes the national day of mourning for some, and others like me. And I've written, you can just put Randy Woodley Thanksgiving and come up with about 5 different articles in different places. I've written that I think it's a time, one of the few times that we have to actually celebrate that there was some camaraderie, at least for a little while. And we don't have enough of those myths. But I just read a young Navajo woman's post Thanksgiving, and she said that she would feed the pilgrims if she had it to do over again, which is a sort of a radical statement with some people who are saying, you know, we hate the pilgrims. This is the beginning of our oppression. But she said, because our teachings teach us to love and to feed those who are hungry and to take care of them. And so we have to be able to do that regardless of what the outcome is going to be. And, you know, and I said in a comment, you know, this is the heart of the elders who taught me as well. Those are the most tolerant, loving, wise people that I will probably ever know on earth. And most of them are gone now. So, yeah. And now we have, you know, I don't want to be too harsh, but what I would call like neo-traditional people,
Okay.
who are intolerant. And like that's probably one of the most characteristic things. And to be intolerant is not the teachings that I received. And to be very tolerant and accepting is a better way for us all to live. So, so yeah, I think we're in trouble, and we need to continue to listen to the voices of some of those who have gone on, and hopefully some who are still here. So,
wow. When you say the new younger voices are intolerant, would radical be a word that you could substitute there?
I don't know. I've been called radical a lot.
Sure.
But I don't think it's because I'm intolerant. I think it's because I'm saying things that people that disrupt the normal their normal thinking patterns. Right?
Yeah. The reason I ask is I'm just trying to get to. It seems like there's a fine line between tolerance and openness and acceptance and standing up for what you believe, right? And I'm imagining there's a lot of that tension in Indigenous American culture.
Yeah. You know, we have our things that we have to deal with. It's and you know, I think being able to admit when you're wrong is a big thing. It's okay to be wrong. It's just as long as you admit when you're wrong. I've had to do that a lot. And you know, cultivating humility. And it's nice to have people around you who will assist you in cultivating that humility by reminding you that you're just a human being.
Yeah. Yep. Can you think of a parallel, you know, in the Christian tradition, can you think of a parallel to the elders in Native American culture?
So, you know, I've known a lot of great white people who I would say are like elders. Yeah. But we always say they're elders and they're old people. And it's not the same.
Yeah.
And so I look for that like heart of tolerance and wisdom and love and care and acceptance and you know, what, regardless of where it's coming from, I think you know, you don't have to be native to have wisdom.
Yes.
Yeah. Let's veer back into the nerddom for a little bit if we can. So you said at one point, I'm going to quote this here, I call Native American religious reality epistemological orthopraxy.
Yeah, I love it.
Where truth comes by understanding how others have lived.
Love it.
Now, as a philosopher, when somebody starts talking about truth in that way, I immediately start to wonder what you mean. So if you could dig a little deeper into that for us, that'd be great.
Yeah, well, truth's kind of a slippery thing, right? Yeah, so how do we come to know what is true? The base, and I really went into this a lot deeper in my book in 2010 called Shalom and the Community of Creation and Indigenous Vision. But where we in the West are taught, the educational system in particular is to pass knowledge, you know, from one person to the other. And whereas in the native way is to pass experience. And so what I know because I've heard it, read it, someone has told me, is not at all knowledge. That not, in fact, knowledge without that experience is pretty, actually is damaging. So it's like, what have I actually done and what have I experienced? And what about, what the experiences of others, that counts too, right? So we don't have to always learn from our own mistakes. But, and that's the point of a lot of our stories and ceremonies and songs and things like this, is to learn these things, to learn what happens when, you get prideful and coyote comes for you, and, and you get lost and all those kinds of things. This is what all these stories are about, is to try and teach us things. But I also can't just say, well, because I know these stories, I have wisdom or I know truth. It's when it's put to the test in life. And so people who live that discover what truth is, and people who don't live it don't have truth.
Mm-hmm. So the ortho part of the orthopraxy is grounded in what? Is it a kind of group flourishing or trial and error?
I'd say the ortho is about common values. Yeah, it's the common values that we all share. Really, we would say common good, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
In the
Yeah.
Western world. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. There's so many more things.
I know. I'll ask
There's
another
so many
question and
great
you can.
parallels to
Yeah.
Yeah.
So kind of related. You speak to harmony being seemingly the goal of Indigenous American theology or spirituality, and I loved what the 10 tenets of most Native American religions or spirituality. And when you speak of harmony, it reminds me so much of what Christians would call new creation, or what our Jewish brothers and sisters would call Shalom. Can you speak to this idea of harmony being the goal to which this is our work as human beings and as people on the land, and how that might be something that you can see in all cultures, basically?
Yeah. So I came at this knowing that in my own culture and several Native cultures I've been around, we had a sort of a harmony way, right? In Cherokee, we would call it, one of the words for it would be Elahe.
What does that mean?
Elahe, it means harmony, it means peace, it means, everybody's being fed, nobody's going hungry. It means that nobody's at war. It means the ground's healthy and producing what it's supposed to, and life as it's meant to be lived, right? So, and we all, in my PhD dissertation, I queried 45 different tribes and 12 elders, spiritual leaders, and every single tribe had a harmony way construct, right? And then I began to realize that, because I was going to school with about 60% from people around the world, that also Ikalahan Filipinos had that same harmony way, but they call it something else. And Sami people up in Scandinavia had it, and Zulus have it. They call it Umbutu. And, Maasai have it. And, Maori have it in New Zealand, and Aboriginal people. And so it's like, these are the original instructions. These are the original ways to live, the original values. And that's why also you find it in ancient Judaism. You have Shalom. So this is a kind of Shalom and Tikkun together, this justice and peace and all of these things and all the derivatives of that. And I go into that deeply again in this book, Shalom and the Community of Creation, and compare the Native American harmony way to the to really Walter Brueggemann's construct of Shalom. And there's so many similarities in those 10 values that I found, which all have sort of subsidiary values as well, but those would all be consistent with the teachings of Jesus. Jesus came, I think we have the whole understanding of what the purpose of Jesus was and is wrong. He came about restoring this ancient system of shalom and what I call the Shalom Sabbath Jubilee construct. And he makes it abundantly clear in Luke chapter 4. and Luke really makes it clear throughout his whole book. But yeah, so there's a lot of similarities, and I think that if we can live that way, that's not only the way that indigenous people have been taught to live, but it's the way that Jesus taught us to live. The Western worldview is what has disrupted that.
Mm-hmm.
The Western worldview, as it's involved itself with empire, and that includes the church as well, is toxic to the harmony way. It teaches the opposite values. Its teachings are antithetical to the teachings of Jesus. It's about competition, not cooperation. It's about, greed, not about sharing. It's about, individualism, not, corporate thinking. It's, and I go through, actually, I have a number of charts and stuff in that book that compare this. And I know there's more than one Western worldview, and I know there's more than one indigenous worldview, but I'm talking about the general worldview that is ubiquitous throughout our colonial systems of education and economics, and our social systems, and our legal systems, etc. So all of those are built on principles that are against the harmony way, against Shalom, against the teachings of Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Our producer, who's off camera right now, but he keeps asking me and Kyle to talk about capitalism and our take on capitalism, and we keep telling him we're not qualified, we're not economists or whatever. What would you, as a Native American Jesus follower, what do you think of the capitalist system?
So, I mean, if you look at the whole, what I would call the Shalom Sabbath Jubilee construct throughout the scriptures, all the safety nets that were in place, the Sabbath systems of setting aside a seventh of your land, don't glean the edges of your field, all of this, set aside every seventh year, all of your land, all of these safety nets that were in place to take care of the poor, the marginalized, the disenfranchised, specifically widows, orphans, foreigners, all of that. And then the prophets calling everybody back to that. And then Jesus, as his announcement, this is what I'm about. This is the thing I'm about. Jubilee is here. And then the rest of the New Testament basically is trying to explain, like, how do we live like that, right? So what I have to say about it is that, that I think most societies today in this modern world work best with a combination of socialism and capitalism working together. So in the ancient Jewish system, it was at Jubilee, everything, everything goes back. The land goes back, prisoners are set free, debts are canceled, all that. Nobody can get too wealthy and nobody can get too poor. And so I believe in a limited form of capitalism, not an unrestrained. I believe in safety nets and all of that. But, in the US, we have veered way too far on the individualistic, capitalistic, greedy side. And we need to come way back to more socialistic principles and safety nets.
Would you say that's more of an indigenous perspective?
I'm just speaking for myself. I don't speak for all indigenous people. I think, but when you go to the reservation and when you're in families, native families, it's all about sharing, giving, hospitality, generosity, all of those kinds of things. So I have to think that's built in there somewhere. Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about racism, if I can, kind of bring it down. Apologies. So you talk in the book about, you call it post-colonial stress disorder. Can you describe what that is?
Yeah. Eduardo Duran has written a book about post-colonial stress syndrome for Native people. He's a psychologist. He's written several books, actually, but on trauma, and basically we know that our trauma is passed on intergenerationally, and almost all Native people, if not all Native people, suffer from post-colonial stress syndrome. or and it's basically having everything taken from you, told that you're no good, and then left you in a bunch of systems that leave you powerless, and to say, now just be like one of us. And that's very traumatic. It's very stressful. And then as a result, it creates a lot of dysfunction. And then we begin to now have people who are victims of post-traumatic stress syndrome, um, because of the individual things that happen as a result of post-colonial stress syndrome. Is that helpful?
Yeah, very helpful. You also, so I want to talk about systemic injustice, and that was kind of a segue into that. So you have one of the simpler explanations of systemic injustice, and I would class racism in as a type of that, but it's not just racism, that I've encountered, and I love it, and it's very pedagogical, and it involves parents and DNA, and I'm wondering if you could just give us that metaphor.
Yeah, this is one of my sort of things I give to every group of my students. I forgot to say that I'm also a professor at Portland Seminary.
We'll tell everybody that at the introduction.
Yeah. So, but that I'll only be doing that for 2 more weeks, and then I retire. So,
Congratulations.
yeah. So, uh, question again?
Systemic injustice metaphor.
DNA. Yeah. So I'm always saying to my classes, it's sort of things work like this, structures work like this. Everybody wants a change, right? But everybody also wants homeostasis. In other words, the things to stay the same. I want change as long as it doesn't affect anything differently. And so people want to keep their salaries, people want to keep their jobs. And when you start changing things, it creates what they think is instability, right? And so they say, okay, well, let's fix the system by doing this, and let's fix this. But it's always the same parents who are fixing the system. So if the system has only 2 parents, you can only get DNA from those 2 parents. And so the only way to introduce new DNA is to invite another parent in. In other words, someone with power, someone with authority to be able to change things. And so this is how things begin to move and change. It's different than tokenism. It's actually giving people who, like, if we're talking about racism, for example, and I always say, don't hire one person of color, hire several. And when we all sit down and create something together, we have a different outcome. Otherwise, it ends up just history repeats itself. And in a way, an easy structure to look at this in is the church. So how many generations have they been sitting around dying going, how do we get young people in the church? Well, you put a bunch of young people in charge of deciding how you get young people in the church, right? But so otherwise you just keep try this and that and everything else, or how do you draw people to church, church buildings, and so we had all these different movements, and the megachurch movement and the Hillsong movement, and all the different things that try to appeal to people. But did you ever think about, like, asking the non-church people why they would even want to come to church? Mm-hmm. I mean, so you have to begin to think outside the box. One of the problems is that we build structures in the West, like I said, toward homeostasis. We don't build the way that God builds. God builds in open systems, like fractals, right? God builds in systems that adapt. Nature's number one rule is adaptation. It's like nature's going to survive because it knows how to adapt, but people don't. And so when we think of everything is in chaos, like right now, climate change, for example, we think that's chaos, but that's actually nature doing what nature does. It's adapting. It's like, okay, if people are going to be the number one consumers of energy and they're supposed to only be tertiary consumers, then I'm going to adapt by getting rid of people, right? And so what we think is chaos is actually order, and what we call order, which is fighting against entropy, fighting against adaptation, fighting against change, that's what's chaos. That's what's chaotic.
Yeah. I'm going to think about that for a while.
Yeah. Same. Yep. As we think about repair and healing that needs to be done and reparations that need to happen between white Americans and Native Americans, you say in the book at one point that Europeans always ask, what can we do? And we want a quick fix. And this doesn't seem to be something you think is helpful. What are better questions we can ask? What is a better journey towards healing and harmony and reparations, Randy?
Well, I think listening's really good, for a long time. And then maybe a better question than because there's a lot of presumptions with the, how can we fix this? It's like the presumption, especially from white folks who have been taught, and part of this is the fault of the land itself. The land itself is so open and so non-limiting that it created a culture that is very open and thinking that it could basically solve any problem, right? And so part of that is actually just being an American. But the assumption also is like, because of the relationship between white folks and non-white folks, particularly if we think about Native Americans, has been very much the subject to the object, right? Whether it's mission or anything else, it's like we are the subject and you are the object. And so we're objectified, right? So if you're going to begin to ask those questions, then you have to think differently. And you have to say, all right, I'm here. Or even like just show up and be on the outside. And then when someone says, why are you here? Then you get the chance to talk. Like I tell people all the time, they're like, well, how do we get to know the natives in our area? I'm like, well, they have powwows and they have public events all the time. Ask if you can be on the cleanup crew. And maybe after 3 or 4 times, there's somebody's going to say, hey, why do you guys come out here anyway? And then maybe you'll make a friend, but it's sort of the presumption of saying, how do we fix this? Means that, like, one, we're white, we're American, of course we can fix this. And that also means that, of course, you're not white and you can't fix this. In other words, you're helpless. You're the object. And so, and then the assumption also is like that it can be fixed. So if it could be fixed so easily, it would have been fixed a long time ago. But there is a place in the power dynamic where the people in power have to actually say, yes, there is a part that we have to play in fixing this. But it should be basically as junior partners, not large and in charge, which is the American way, but saying to the people who have been oppressed or objectified, or whether it's women or whoever it is, you guys are in charge, kind of tell us what to do,
Mm-hmm. Do you have any real hope that will occur in the United States?
Of course. I've seen it. I mean, it's if I didn't have hope, I wouldn't be doing this, because it's cost too much. It's cost me too much. So I have hopes that even if I don't see a lot of things happen in my lifetime, that eventually my children or grandchildren will. So, and that's what I'm working towards.
Brilliant. You say that you've been running a sweatshop for
sweatshop. Hold on.
Hold on.
Just to clarify, I do not run a sweatshop.
Good. All right. Let's start that over. You say you've run a sweatshop.
Jesus, right?
Oh my.
It's in your head.
Yep. You say
that's why I get my clothes so cheap. Yeah, that's it.
Oh my God.
Take 3.
Yeah. You say you've been running a sweat lodge for about 30 years, and you've seen remarkable things. One of the things you say in the book is that you've seen like the whitest of white people spend a night in the sweat lodge and be completely transformed because of that one night. I want to know what happens in a sweat lodge and what's so transformative, and can I come and spend a night in your sweat lodge?
That's what he really wants to know. Can I do that?
So it's a great mystery. No, I'm just teasing. Yeah. So a sweat lodge is it's sort of like a sauna, right? You've been to a sauna. So it's like a Swedish sauna, but and think of a Native American sauna that's made of earth and rocks on a, and it marries a Wednesday night prayer meeting, and that's what kind of what a sweat is. So, so you're inside. Rocks are brought in that are hot. You pour water on them. People are in this circle under this, tent like thing, this half round canvas thing, and you pray and you share songs and you share what's on your heart, and that's what takes place, and it happens in complete dark with sweat pouring out of your body, and prayers come in songs, and it's sharing from your heart out of your the depth of you, and it's just a very holistic, complete embodiment experience that I think a lot of white people have never had, and I think sometimes it just clicks, and they're changed. Yeah, but I mean, it happens for a lot of people, not just white people. But I've seen some pretty what somebody might say double white people all of a sudden realize that there's so much more to life than sort of this lot they've been given by attending church and sitting and watching the back of somebody's head, and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's the death of spirituality, if you will. Yeah.
And is it the sensory experience and the darkness and the extreme?
Yeah, I think it's all that. It's all that.
Yeah, sounds fascinating.
Yes, once we get our sweat, we haven't been running sweat for 2 years because of COVID.
Okay.
It's basically be like a petri dish, right?
Yeah.
So as soon as COVID says goodbye, we put the sweat back up. So.
Brilliant. Do you have anything else, Kyle?
You didn't answer if Randy could come.
Oh yeah.
That was the ultimate.
Yes, you may.
All right.
We're not in there all night, just so you know. I mean, it only lasts usually a couple hours, 2-3 hours. Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure that's an intensely long time in the pitch black and in an environment like that.
Yeah, it's great.
Brilliant.
Awesome.
Is that it?
Yeah, my computer died, so that's it for me.
You sign off.
Well, Randy Woodley, it's been really awesome talking to you. It could easily have gone a couple more hours. Maybe we can do it again. I've got a bunch of more books of yours I want to read now. So thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate being here.
Cool.
All right. Thanks so much. That really was a lot of fun. And if if you're generous with your time, we would definitely come knocking on your publisher's door again. We'd love to crack open another book and have another conversation.
Okay. Well, yeah, there's just the last one I published is called Mission and the Cultural Other.
We didn't even talk about missions.
Yeah, what's that?
We didn't even talk about missions, which is kind of one of your main things, right?
Yeah. So yeah, if you want to talk about that sometime, that would be good, because it's a whole different approach. And basically what I say is that Western missions is the foundation of Western missions is white supremacy. So
yeah, man. Yeah, we could dig
Let's
into
do
that
it. Yeah,
for sure.
We must.
Yes.
Yep, absolutely. Awesome.
You guys know that we have a podcast too, right? Did you know that?
Oh, why don't you go ahead and give a blurb for it, and we'll include it in the episode.
Okay, so it's Bo Sanders and myself. I don't know if you guys know of Bo. He used to be with Trip Fuller and Theology Nerd Throwdown and Homebrewed Christianity.
Yep.
But anyway, he and I do one called Piecing It All Together, Peacing. Nice. And we've done close to 100 episodes now, I think.
What do you guys talk about?
Everything.
Piece it together, Randy, obviously.
Piecing it all together.
Awesome. Yeah. All right. Piecing it together. Find it on
Piecing
your...
it all together.
Piecing it all together.
Piecing it all together.
Awesome.
All right, guys. Good to meet you, and hope to see you down the road here.
Absolutely. Yeah. Take care, Randy.
Right. Thanks.